Chapter 18. The Festival of Floating Lights. The first hint that the lake town was preparing for something special came as a paper notice tacked to the inn's porch. A small square with careful handwriting that invited travelers and neighbors to gather at twilight for the festival, when lanterns would be set upon the water and wishes would be sent out into the night like gentle boats of hope. Aiden read the card aloud as Mira traced the edges with her fingertips, and both felt the quiet lift that comes when a town offers a tradition and the day begins to arrange itself around it. They had woken early and walked the path along the lake that they had come to know, each step softened by the calm that travel had placed in their pockets, each breath tasting of pine and clean cold. The lake's surface kept its steady promise and showed them themselves as two joined shapes walking along a blue that thought about silver. The innkeeper stepped out with a basket to shake its crumbs toward the birds and told them that the festival belonged to the town much as a lantern belongs to the hand that lights it. It marked gratitude at winter's turn and asked the water to carry gentle thoughts through the valley and back to the people who sent them. She said the paper sellers had already brought stacks of thin rice sheets and the carpenters had mended the folding frames. And she asked if Aiden and Mira would like to join the afternoon making and learn how to fold the edges so that the lantern would float without complaint. They agreed at once, not because festivals were rare in their lives, but because this one looked so much like a mirror held up to everything they had been building since the first night at the cafe, when a blue pane of glass had caught the light and suggested a story. They spent the morning wandering to the market to return a borrowed book of footpaths, and they wrote a short note to the librarian at home saying that the valley had taught them to see reflections as faithful listeners. At a stall under a canvas sheet, a woman sold little strings of paper stars in colors that looked like the names of seasons, and Mira selected a tiny white one and slipped it into her pocket to carry a little of the lake's brightness back to haven and horizon. Aiden found a packet of small brushes with plain wooden handles and bought them from a man who explained that every handle had been sanded by his grandfather's hands, which seemed like the kind of detail paint likes to remember. They ate simple soup in bowls that warmed their palms and watched the townspeople bring tables to the shore, the kind of communal work that happens without anyone needing to direct it, a choreographed kindness that sets out its purpose with a broom, a cloth, a line of chairs, a wrapped coil of rope, a bundle of twine. In the afternoon they joined the folding. A long table had been set near the water with stacks of square frames and piles of tissue and small pots of paste and brushes that looked like attendants at a ceremony. Children folded and unfolded and tried again until their joins held. A pair of friends bent over a pattern book to argue gently about angles and then laughed when the lantern they had made looked like a small house ready for rain. The man with the clean hat from the train stood at the end of the line and tied twine into neat loops that would anchor the lanterns to slender reeds for the first moments of floating and keep them from drifting too soon. Aiden dipped a brush into paste and learned the rhythm of fold, press, smooth lift. Mira followed with paper and fitted each side so precisely that the corners met like a handshake. They spoke softly while they worked. He said the lake felt like a cousin to the sea at home, less restless, more reflective, but family all the same. She said the scent of the paste reminded her of the greenhouse on a warm day when potting soil wakes and the wooden potting bench gives up a stored sweetness. A boy with a knitted cap asked if they would sign one of the lanterns so that later he could find it and imagine their faces among the floating lights. And they signed with small letters and a tiny drawing of a leaf with a square of blue inside it, which made him grin. As the sun moved toward the tops of trees, the sky turned that settled color that means evening intends to be kind, and the surface of the lake took on a deeper tone in anticipation of holding so many small fires. The townspeople brought a row of iron braziers to the shore and set kindling in them so the lanterns could be lit without rush. The innkeeper placed a low table nearby and laid out thin sticks tipped with cotton and a bowl of oil. And she showed how each wick should be twined once and set inside its small holder so that the flame would rise at a steady pace and rest just below the paper rim. Aiden and Mira listened as students do when the lesson belongs to a beloved practice. When the moment came to make their own lantern, they did not look for a different table or a quiet corner. They stood where they were among the others and folded the paper with the care they gave to anything that asked to be kept. The frame squared itself and the corners held. Aiden brushed the paste in a patient line and Mira set the paper over it and smoothed the seam until it lay flat like a line drawn with a calm mind. They wrote nothing on the sides yet. They looked at the blank panels and let them stay blank, the way a space is left on a page when a sentence is being chosen. The braziers were lit. The cotton wicks took the oil and darkened and then brightened. The innkeeper lifted her hand and the hum of talk softened into that natural hush that comes when a group feels the weight of a shared beginning. She spoke no grand speech. She said only that the lights would be carried together and that the lake would listen as it had listened for many years, and that those who wanted to whisper something to the water could do so, and those who wanted to remain quiet could do so too. Then she stepped back and the night took over its part of the work. Aiden and Mira walked to the near edge with their lantern held between them as if it were a bowl of warm water that could not be spilled. They dipped the wick in oil, steadied the paper with their fingers, and let the first flame blossom in the small holder. The light swelled softly and then found its level, and the inside of the lantern turned gold. The paper glowed as if it remembered sunlight. They carried it to the shallows where reeds bent in the gentlest of breezes and set it down on the water the way a person rests a cup on a table after a long story. It floated without argument and moved a tiny distance forward. Around them the shore bloomed with light. One by one the lanterns touched the lake and learned to drift, and the wide dark became a field of small golden squares. The people of the town kept their voices low, and their low voices made the kind of chorus that can hold a wish without breaking it. Aiden and Mira stood side by side and felt the warmth of the braziers behind them and the cool of the lake on their faces. He reached for her hand and she gave it in the quiet, and together they watched the first line of lanterns make a slow path toward the middle water where the reflections deepened and each light sat above its twin. It seemed then that the lake held a second sky. The lantern they had made carried no words yet, only the weight of their attention which a light can sense. After a while, Mira took a pencil from her pocket and asked Aiden if he would like to write something, and he asked her the same thing at the same time, and they smiled because it had happened again, the neat coincidence that sits often at the center of their days. She wrote their names very small on one side and drew two squares that faced each other like friendly windows. He wrote on another panel the name of the cottage so that it would travel among the lights and perhaps the lake would return that name to them later when they were home. On the panel facing the shore he drew three tiny lines like the stems of leaves, and on the last panel he wrote "Thank you" without a signature because gratitude does not belong to the person who writes it. They set the lantern back and let it go, and it moved among the others as if it had known the route all along. The festival continued as night settled deeper. A group of musicians set soft tunes on strings and wood that did not try to crowd the air. Children carried shorter poles and laughed as their lanterns found their first balance. Couples who had known many seasons walked slowly and held each other's arms. A woman stood apart and watched with a look that suggested someone far away and someone very near had both been included. The innkeeper passed with a tray that held small cups of spiced tea and offered them out like a kind aunt passing blankets. Aiden and Mira drank and then walked the curve of the shore to see how the lights looked from different angles, and each turn of the path offered a new version of the same calm. At one bend the lanterns seemed to float into the mouth of the river and slip toward the valley, though in truth they stayed within the cove, guided by a slow thread of current and the gentle arms of reeds. At another bend the reflection gathered into a single band that looked solid enough to walk upon, and a child asked his mother if the lake was making a road for the lights, and the mother said quietly that sometimes water makes roads for thoughts, and the child nodded as if he had always known. When they returned to the place where their lantern had been set afloat, they found it near the center with many others, and for a few heartbeats it drifted so that its panels turned toward them one by one. They saw their names pass over the lake, and then the small windows facing, and then the cottage name, and then the word they had left for the night. Aiden felt a warmth move through him that had nothing to do with the braziers and everything to do with recognition. The feeling he had first known when he stepped into the Lantern Cafe and saw Mira with the ferns and understood without understanding that his days wanted to lean toward hers. Mira felt a calm rise like water in a clear glass. The same calm that met her when she watched Aiden stand at horizon and learn a reflection. The same calm that showed itself the night Aiden's bloom opened and the greenhouse began to smell like the memory of summer. They stood like that for a while, saying nothing because some moments prefer not to be interrupted by words. The music shifted to a tune that made small circles and then widened just enough to allow a memory to sit inside it. The conductor from the train appeared at their side and remarked softly that the lanterns looked the same every year and completely new every year, which might be the best way for anything to be. He said he always looked for a light that carried gratitude on one panel because it reminded him to check the corners of his own days for what had been given. Then he tipped his hat and moved on as if conducted by the very water. The night deepened into its most honest color. Stars touched the sky in points and the lanterns answered in squares. And in the reflection the shapes combined into a pattern the mind could not name and did not need to. A soft bell rang to say that those who wished to gather their lanterns later could do so when the cove rope was drawn, and those who wished to let theirs drift out and be tended by the boat with long arms could trust that the water would carry the messages as far as needed. Aiden and Mira decided to bring their lantern back to the shore so that they could carry the very same paper and frame home and place it on the table between their two windows. They waited until the first gathering boats came near and then accepted a long pole with a tiny hook and leaned together toward the water and guided the square gently back toward their hands. When they lifted it, the wick glowed a little longer and then went out, and a curl of thin smoke wrote a brief line in the air that the night understood and folded away. They set the lantern on the shore to rest and let any water fall from it and thanked the lake in the low way a person thanks a room that has listened. They remained by the water after most people had moved back toward the inn and the square with the soup tables and the musicians and the jugs of tea. The lanterns that remained on the lake seemed to choose a soft stillness, hanging in place like patient thoughts. The cliff faces accepted the night and gave back a faint suggestion of line where dark met darker. The trees made a black lace that only the eyes could read. Mira leaned lightly into Aiden's shoulder and spoke at last. She said the lights on the water felt like a reflection of the life they had been making, each small square carrying its own flame, each reflection steady beneath it, the whole surface of the lake like a book where every page was the same and new. Aiden answered in the quiet that her voice had shaped. He said that when the lantern had turned and the panel with thank you had faced them, he understood that the words did not belong to either of them alone. They belonged to the town that had taught them to mend a greenhouse, to the cafe board that had kept every card safe, to the clock tower that had counted their best hours without judgment, to the windows that had learned to hold two different worlds and introduce them to each other across a small table. Mira nodded and added the lake to that list and the train that had carried them and the innkeeper who had folded the first corner and the child who had asked for their signatures so that a stranger's light could become familiar. They returned the lantern to the inn with the care one gives to a friend for whom sleep has been prepared. The innkeeper placed it on a shelf near the door so it could dry and told them she would wrap it in tissue in the morning for the train home. In the common room people spoke in the tired, happy voices that come after a feast of looking. Someone tuned a violin for a lullaby and then changed their mind and tuned the note back into quiet. The stove sighed in the way that suggests contentment. Aiden and Mira climbed the stairs with the heaviness that follows a day well used and slipped into a room that had learned their shape in a short time. The window held a triangle of night where one last lantern glowed against a notch in the trees, and they watched it until their eyes fell closed. Morning gathered slowly. They woke before the sun touched the ridge and lay listening to how winter light arrives, first as a thinning darkness, then as a promise of color, then as a hue that clothes each thing without bragging. They dressed and went to the lake for a last look. The lanterns had been gathered from the water and stood in neat rows to dry. The shore looked modest and good, like a stage after a play when the actors have gone home and the boards remember the lines. The innkeeper gave them the wrapped lantern and a small bundle with tea and a piece of bread to eat on the train, and asked them to tell the sea in Waverly Bay that the lake had enjoyed the conversation. They promised and meant it. At the station, the conductor smiled again and said that certain journeys know when to end and that those journeys are the easiest to begin again later. The train moved down the valley with the same patience with which it had climbed, and they watched the landscape unfold in reverse and felt that nothing had been lost from seeing both directions. They spoke very little, pressed hands as the river showed its back and the cliff gave up its ice, and tasted the inn's bread and tea and let that simple breakfast become part of their memory of the festival. A town with a blue cup in a window slipped by and they waved, and the cup seemed to answer. When the afternoon train reached the lower lands and the air began to carry salt, they felt the homeward tide catch their thoughts. The station at Waverly Bay stood with its reliable face, and the cat made a small circle and then approved their return. The attendant asked if the lakes had kept their reflections, and they said yes, and he nodded as if they had reported on an old friend. They walked to the cafe and wrote a line for the board that said the lake carries light just as well as the sea does and will tell you so if you ask it kindly. And the owner placed 2 cups in their hands and a spare for later. At the cottage they opened Haven and Horizon and set the wrapped lantern in the middle of the table and unwrapped it as gently as they had folded it. The paper held the faint sweetness of the festival, and the wick carried a small scent of oil. They touched the panels they had written and traced the 2 little windows and the word they had sent into the night. Aiden set it beside their first lantern so that the 2 could learn each other, and for a moment it seemed the bubble in the aqua square deepened with welcome. Mira set the string of paper stars she had bought at the lake town along the sill so that at dusk the windows would have their own quiet celebration. They made tea and sat and told their house the story of the lake and the braziers and the soft music and the boat with long arms. And the house listened the way good houses do, with warmth at the corners and a floor that holds its creak a little longer to say it has understood. Later, when evening stretched across the water and the clock tower began its tender count, they lit their lantern and watched the light breathe against the glass. And for a heartbeat they saw the lake return their names and the word they had written, and felt the festival reach across distance, golden and calm and joined to everything they had built. A quiet promise afloat in a room that had learned their footsteps. A gentle glow mirrored in 2 windows that faced different worlds yet gathered into one, eternal in the way simple things become eternal when tended every day with patience.